Hello, everybody. It's the top of the hour. We're going to get started today. Let's get moving this forward. Today's topic is a how-to guide for checklists and tasks. So this is part of the May webinar series on practice management. We started off at the beginning of the month with basis of practice management. Then we talked about standardized processes, capacity planning, managing the work and never missing a deadline. And now we're on to the how-to part of it with checklists and tasks. If you want to find out more, sign up for additional webinars and whatnot, go to carbonhq.com/events to be able to sign up for more. I think next month we're going to be doing sales and marketing as well. So before we get started, just a few tips, a few tricks out there. We are in GoToWebinar. If you're not familiar with it, that little orange button there will expand and collapse the window. I suggest closing the apps like Skype, other ones that might slow the connection down. And then we will discuss questions during, if you use the question area on your control panel, but I'll definitely make sure that there's time at the end to answer questions as we go. You can use the chat as well, but generally just use the questions. I'll follow that more closely. Let's go to the next piece. Who am I? My name is Ian Vason. I'm the Vice President and co-founder of Carbon. I've been in the industry for about 15 years, working at Xero, leading the US operation for it for 4 or almost 4, and then at Intuit for over 10, and then in tech for the last almost 25 years. To introduce Carbon, we are task management for accountants. You'll see a couple screenshots today. We are not doing a demo of Carbon. If you want to learn more about Carbon, go to carbonhq.com. A little screenshot there, but Carbon brings together your email, allows you to triage those emails and bring those inboxes together to ultimately set up and tee up work so that you can use checklists and tasks to get it done. All that information is brought together using contacts and contact management and searchable from across all the different pieces of work that you have. Again, if you want to learn more about Carbon, go to carbonhq.com. Click the Get Carbon button if you want to come on board. So what have we been talking about? Just to bring it back to those of you that have been on the earlier parts, the anatomy of the modern firm's got 2 parts. Client services are on the left. You have one, or you may have many, but there's 7 different client services that you could have. If not talking about financial wealth management, those types of things. And so those services interface with what you have inside your firm, the practice management, different components, and ultimately that's brought together from communication and client management components overall. And so today we're going to specifically deep down on that far right one called project and task management. But again, you'll see how client communications and practice communications have an impact on that as well. So what's our plan and agenda for today? We're going to first start off by talking about our standardized processes, because that really is the impetus and the start to even talk about doing any sort of management of tasks and projects and whatnot. Do a quick little overview, and then we're going to jump and spend a majority of our time on the how and the what of tasks and project management. And then I've got a little bit in the wrap up. I've got some tips and tricks that you can use across that whole spectrum of stuff. So again, we got a full hour of content today, so let's just dig right into it. And the first bit we're going to talk about is workflow and standardized processes. Now, I'm going to go a little bit higher level today, because if you wanted to actually get to the full meat and the details, you can go ahead and get the recording for standardized processes discussion. But let's just go through it a quick high level. The reason why I want to talk about standardized processes now and before we go into the other bits is your tasks and your projects are useless if you don't understand the processes by which you're trying to drive them. Less so in terms of task management, because to-dos, for instance, can be one-offs, but they're generally, when you think of checklists, that's a set of tasks or to-dos in some sort of sequential order, and therefore that is a process. And so really understanding and defining your processes is going to allow for you to ultimately have better visibility and maintain better quality when serving your clients. So the first part about this is really just kind of a high-level understanding of where to start and how to be smart about it. And so it's the first step really is understanding what processes you're trying to improve. And a lot of folks have a hard time on determining which ones are really important or which ones they should address first. So if you're not sure and you don't have the analytics, or you're doing the tracking around understanding which ones seem to be taking longer than they should, Then start with what bothers you. And if you don't know what bothers you, ask your team, because I guarantee you they will tell you right from the moment that you ask what seems out of place, what frustrates them, and where they feel that there's massive inefficiencies in what we're doing today. The next piece of that is really, if you're not measuring what success looks like and measuring those processes, then doing any sort of change to that is really, guesswork, because you don't necessarily know how much you're impacting it, and that really, hurts you in terms of understanding whether you're making a positive change and how much you're making it and what you should double down on, or whether or not you can claim success. If you don't know what you're doing today, you need to figure it out, and that's the only way to, as a starting point, to get to where you want to be tomorrow. Technology is just an enabler. Don't go after technology first. Go after it after you understand your processes and determine whether or not it's a good fit for what you're trying to do. And if it is, then go seek out which one of those bits is going to help you out. And then the last piece that we've talked about before is the change management journey, especially with process improvement and redefining and updating processes. It requires quite a bit of training, cross-functional understanding and support, building, and then adoption. And so don't second guess the amount of effort there. And so that's what led to this 10 steps to process improvement. And again, I'm going to go through it a little bit faster today. So again, if you want more, you can contact me afterwards in order to talk about it. But again, the first one is the steps to process improvement is, you need to understand, what you're going to optimize. And we talked about that before. You can start with what bothers you. And then you need to discuss it with your existing team. And again, forming a cross-functional team of those who do the work, those who manage the work, and then yourself as the owner of the process or the owner of the firm. Then you need to agree on what success looks like from a team perspective and how you're going to measure it. And then you've got to go down where most people haven't done this, is mapping out. Again, you can use process flow charts and so forth. You could use sticky notes. You could just use a piece of paper, a whiteboard, whatever it might be. But you want to map out what that current process is and all the various variants that people are doing off that process, because that leads to the next step of, why are those variants existing? Why did people put them in place? What were they trying to optimize? What were they trying to correct for in terms of what we were doing or what we asked people to do? And that really is going to uncover, whether or not certain parts of the process are broken, how they can be improved upon, or where, again, they can be removed and so forth. Then you're going to go step by step through each one of those steps of the process and really ask the hard questions of, do we really need this step? Just because something exists there doesn't necessarily mean it's necessary. When looking at each step, the team's going to talk about, what could be done differently? What could be done better? What are the sort of problems that we're seeing? Where have clients give us some indications of how we're not necessarily serving them correctly? Have our systems changed that support this process? And so going maniacally through each one of those is going to uncover where we could do things differently and how maybe we can ladder things together to provide a much more efficient process. Then you're going to go ahead and create what you think the ideal or the to-be process is with that team, document it down, and then actually put it in test. So again, you've got some folks on that team who are actually going to be doing the work. So put it in motion, do the time study, and understand whether or not the logic's correct, understand whether or not it's making an improvement, and how it's making that improvement. Because when you bring the team back together, it's then understanding, where can we do some additional work and get some additional goodness out of what we're proposing. And then again, if that's determined to be the next step forward, document it and then implement it broadly. But again, goes back to that change management journey of education, training, and so forth. And then it's that constant iteration and further optimization. And again, it may not be that you're doing this today. You may do it quarterly. You may do it, every 6 months. It depends. But the process improvement needs to be continuous, but you may be doing other processes because, again, you want to fully document, fully understand everything you do to serve your clients. And again, just some tips and tricks I put up here. I'm just going to call out a few. One is the cross-functional team. Documentation is so important. They should be living documents. They're accessible online, so that way the team can continue to update, but always be able to see the latest and greatest. When you actually are creating these, you need to preserve the ability to customize. Each client is slightly different. And again, if the process is too rigid, you'll find it falling apart from those who actually have to own and do it. Again, don't underestimate the change management, and you should be updating your processes very, very frequently. So one of the things I want to do here before we move off is I want to throw a polling question up for folks, which is, how often do you actually update your processes. So I'll give it here a moment. Are you constantly doing it, or at least within a monthly time horizon? Are you doing it quarterly, biannually, yearly, or you don't update at all? Let's give that a few more seconds up there. 3, 2, 1. I'm going to close it out. And it looks like we've got a pretty good folks of those who are doing it today and consistently, and those who are doing it yearly or beyond. Getting a little bit of a mixture there in between, but it's either you're doing or you're not based on today's poll. So thank you for submitting that. Let's go ahead and continue on. So again, let's talk a little bit about, so now we've talked about processes, and those processes are really the gateway or the starting point by actually being able to look at the work in a more granular level in order to ensure that we're able to get each one of those pieces out day by day, on time, on quality, and the like. And so I'm going to first talk about just work management overall, and then we're going to dig down into the weeds. So again, I pulled this from the web, but I can't tell you how many times I've consistently gone into practices, and I'll see sticky notes on screens. Again, most practices don't have a single screen. We've got like 3 screens, and there are sticky notes all on the bottom. See scratch pads on the desk. And again, having, there's a need for ultimately understanding what's going on and moving it. This is probably the more inefficient way because there's no prioritization. Reading your own chicken scratch is quite hard. And it's, obviously, the sticky notes fall off and it gets in the way of the keyboard. But, it's all about your organization. It's all about your construction. And it's all about understanding how it all ladders together in order to make sure those processes that we've actually done all that hard work on are going to flow smoothly. And we're all going to be in step together and to ensure the client's successful. So what I want to do here is just go through and look at, sort of the altitude of things as a high level, and then we'll dig into each one of these components. So the first one is really understanding a to-do. And we're going to spend a bit of time on here in the next section, but a to-do is really just a verb, a noun, and an object. And there's a lot of tips and tricks to make that more actionable, especially when you start with a verb, but then we're going to go a little bit broader. But again, it's a simple statement or a sentence in order for you to know where to go next. Now, a checklist is going to be a list of things that you need to do. Those are generally a list of to-dos. So it's things that need to be done or things to consider, and it's used as a reminder in order to understand the fluidity of the work from start to stop, and generally constructed within a project. So a project is a piece of work with a purpose, and again, it usually requires quite a bit of time. So it could have one checklist, it could have multiple checklists, but it's an aggregate of the underlying pieces of work or the components of work that need to be done and gotten out the door. So how does that look when you look across the firm? Again, you've got the scope of work there from a doer to manager to partner, and you can see that the tasks and task management components sit on the bottom end. Doesn't mean that not everyone's doing it. They are, but the manager is more responsible for the processes, so the overarching checklists, the projects overall, what they're, how they're being addressed over time. Are they slipping? Are they not? Are the checklists and processes well defined so that we have repeatability? And the partner's really owning the outcomes of the client and the practice overall. And so that altitude and scope of responsibility really translates into ownership and the adjustments over time. So that's just a little bit of an overview. So we're going to get, again, today's talk was the how-to of task management and project management overall. So that's a bit of our pre-work today. We're going to get into specifically now, let's look at task management in detail. And again, let's pull up another polling question here. Got a bunch here through that I want to capture for folks. So the first one here is, how do you currently track the things that you're doing today? Do you have pen and paper? Are you using a horizontal application, so a generic application that anybody could use? Examples of that might be an Excel, might be Asana, it could be Evernote, one of those. A vertical application, that would be something that's specific to the industry that we're in. That could be, Carbon, for instance. It could be some other products, and then, some other method. I don't know what that might be. It might be not a scratch pad, but a sticky note and some sort of odd sort of setup. I don't know. Again, give a couple more seconds here. Let's close the poll. And a majority of almost everybody here is doing a horizontal application like an Evernote or an Asana, whilst there's a few people using pen and paper and some vertical ones. So thank you very much. So let's go and first talk about constructing to-dos. And this is really critical. This is where we see a lot of people wasting a lot of time, and it really comes into not understanding the context and the reason for the creation of the to-do when looking at it later. And so the first thing to note is a to-do is really just a verb with a noun and an object. A lot of times what you're going to see is just a verb and a noun, and that verb is a passive verb when it needs to be an active verb. Now, I know that you didn't come in today to really talk about a lesson in grammatical components, but it's really important. So I want to highlight why that's important in a series of different examples. And so when we see a lot of folks that are doing task management, they'll write just scribble something down as quickly as they can. I mean, I can look in here, I was scribbling some notes beforehand, and this is just inherent human behavior, but I've got to do this SOW, so I just say do SOW. And here I've used the example of contact Jane. Well, that doesn't really tell me a whole lot. And I just want you to imagine that, okay, well, right now I've written down contact Jane, and that means something to me right now in the moment. But when I look at this next week, I even look at this later in the afternoon, maybe tomorrow, contact Jane doesn't tell me a whole lot and doesn't necessarily remind me of why I was actually creating this to begin with. And so the verb isn't active. There's really, the noun is there. There's really no object though, and there's really no specificity. So I've got to now go and spend a bunch of work just to get the context and understanding of what the heck did I mean when I wrote contact Jane. And what you've done is you've just created a whole lot more work for you, and you're going to be spending a lot more time. And now the chances of completing this task have gone down quite significantly. So the next improvement there is let's just turn it from passive to active. So phone Jane, okay, that's better. So instead of having to figure out, do I email her? Do I pick up the telephone? Do I send a carrier pigeon? I don't know. Let's pick up the phone and call Jane. But the next step there is let's add some sort of direction to that. Well, we've got to phone Jane about her tax return. Okay, well now I've got an understanding of maybe what the work-related component of that is. I know I need to call her, but still, it's not necessarily truly actionable. And therefore, again, I'm going to waste some time. So now let's get some specificity in here. Let's make my life easier, because most likely when I'm writing this to-do, it was the follow-up of something else that I'd already done. And I probably have the information I need already at my fingertips. So let's do the work now so I don't have to do a lot more work later. So if I know the phone number, I'm going to phone Jane, put that in there. If we're talking about the tax return, let's be a little more specific. Now we're talking about tax documentation. Really now we're doing retrieval of information, so maybe we can move that tax return along. But again, let's take it even further. What was the tax doc? So again, I'm going to phone Jane at this phone number, and I need to get that tax return. Now that is a well-constructed to-do, because when I look at that in my list of things I need to do, I can quickly understand what is it, what do I need to do, how do I need to do it, and what is the scope of the thing that needs to be done? Because it's going to help me in terms of prioritizing this across other things that are maybe set. Now, the only piece that's missing here that's actually important, because again, it's going to impact my prioritization, was when is this thing due by? And so again, that's not necessarily constructed in the to-do statement, though if you're actually writing this down and not necessarily using a technology solution, you might have to. But understanding when it's actually due is going to be critical for you to know when to prioritize it. Because even though it's due on Monday, that's the due date of when I need to have this information. I probably always need to do this effort sooner. And so that really helps me to ladder in when I need to do it in amongst the things that I've got to do already across all the activities and clients that I have. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, you have to think about how you're constructing these things and doing them, because you're going to spend a lot less time doing the heavy work up front to really set you up for success when you're looking at this at a later time frame. So time horizon and due dates for to-do. So I've thrown up here a carbon screen, but you can imagine whatever product it's going to be. And again, not necessarily a good example of to-dos being what I've just talked about in terms of the granularity and the specificity. But what I want to get across here is the time horizons by which you want tasks and to-dos. When you go and look at things, you want to be able to construct your tasks for what today is, and look at things. So again, in this case, it's looking at this week, but this is the set of things I had to do for today versus the things I had to do tomorrow. It's actually a separator in there. But I need to be able to see, well, what's happened yesterday, what's happened previous week, what's happening today, what's happening tomorrow, what's happening this week, what's happening next week, and then beyond that. When you go to sleep at night, or before you go to sleep at night, or before you leave the office, you want to take a look to see what you've accomplished based on what you set out to accomplish for the day and what needs to slide into tomorrow. And when you get into the morning, or you open up your laptop, you got your cup of coffee, you want to look at, well, what was slated to be done today that I've already highlighted, what's in the process for tomorrow or this week that I need to roll into today. And I want to be able to construct my plan of attack for the day at the beginning, so I have a good sense of what needs to be done and what order it needs to be progressed. And so that time horizon is really important, because now I can stay focused. But I'm also curating and setting up what I need to do for this week, because when I prioritize today, it's in context of the week. If it doesn't need to be done this week, then it's really just a bucketization of, is it something next week I've got to address because I would just want to simplify teeing that up later, or is it something I need to focus on later? I'm just not even going to consider it. And so that's why you push things out. If you try to do a planning exercise of, I'm going to plan today, I'm going to plan tomorrow, I'm going to plan this week, I'm going to fully plan and prioritize next week, I'm going to do the week after that, I'm going to do this month. By the time 2 or 3 days passes, that whole prioritization is completely out the window. And so it's just a bunch of wasted time. Now, again, putting them in broader buckets is going to help you. And again, that bucket expands as your time horizon expands. And so again, being cognizant of that's really important. The next thing to understand here, and why I put this up here, is you'll notice that there's 2 different dates. There's the date of the to-do and the date of when this thing needs to be completed. Now remember, most tasks and to-dos are components of a checklist, which we're going to go a little bit later. The checklist may have certain due dates of when it has to be completed, because that might be a serial process. That is the time, expected time to complete in order to meet the expected due date that was assigned for the checklist or the project. But that doesn't mean that the due date for the to-do is the same. And I'll give you an example. You may want to get something done previously or prior to when the actual due date is, because you need to prioritize amongst what you're doing, because other things may take importance, or you won't be able to get the input until a certain point. So your work stream is going to adjust based upon that, and maybe want to get it done sooner. The other thing is, you may have to adjust your due date because it's just impossible for you to get it done by the time that the actual checklist due date was. So let's say it hasn't been completed yet. Well, that's going to slip. But that doesn't mean you don't want to take your eye off it in your prioritization. And just having something that tells you that it was due 2 weeks ago doesn't necessarily create confidence for yourself. So you want to be able to make it a commitment. That's what to-dos are. They're a commitment in order for when you're going to do it, and commit when you're going to do it. So if that's going to have to slip, it's fine, but set a new date where it's possible to ultimately get it completed. So I put up here a bunch of things on how to be strategic, and I've talked about some of these already, about what to do with your to-dos and how to approach it. So first was on the construction, and we spent quite a bit of time on this already. Again, it's a verb, an active verb, a noun, and an object. Make your life easy. So again, be specific. Be specific with those active verbs. And be descriptive, as descriptive as you can on the noun and the object. Because as you can see, it's going to tee you up to not have to do a lot of that legwork and discovery work later down the process. Now, the strategy for each to-do is you need to be as granular as possible. The broader that the to-do is, the more the likelihood is you can't do it on one sitting, and you will start it and stop it, and it will just drag and slow down the progression to go through the other things. And so you may have something that says prep tax return. Well, geez, that's a lot. And so that's really a process. That's not really a particular to-do. But if you broke that down into its underlying pieces, again, there's a limit about how granular you need to go. But by doing that, what that does is it allows you to create momentum. And allows you to be able to pick up, stop it, do something else, come back to it, and continue it, without always having to figure out where you left off, and make a lot more work for yourself on being able to kickstart it, and then having a lot of dissatisfaction by not being able to complete it. Again, your things should be really what's in the moment, what's current, and what's immediate. That's what a to-do is. It's not a hope. It's not something that is something you want to do in the future. That to-do is a commitment. You are saying you are going to do it, and it's got a due date of when it needs to be done. So strategy of creating that list. Your list needs to be short for each day and for the week and for tomorrow, for instance. We talk about operating mechanisms, which we'll talk about in general for work overall. The reality is on your to-dos, you're really talking about maybe 5, maybe 10 that you can really get in a day, depending on the granularity that you're writing that. Creating a list of 20 to-dos for one day isn't really something you're going to be able to handle. And there's nothing more satisfying or dissatisfying than getting through the day and looking at the fact that you've only completed a fraction of what you said. Better bet is to create something that's doable. And then if you get additional time available, then move something and promote it up from what maybe is proposed for tomorrow or so forth. But again, you want to keep your list short and manageable and achievable for each and every day. Again, we talked about this already for time horizon, list by today, tomorrow, this week, next week, and later. It's a good way of thinking about it. And then it's really, in terms of task management, it's all about motivation. It's all about progression. There is nothing more satisfying than checking the tick box off, having it crossed out, and moving on. So this is where, again, I would say, even if you're using a scratch pad, a note, just take your pen and scratch through it. It may seem juvenile, but it's really, really good positive reinforcement of what you're doing. And progression really does a lot in terms of keeping you motivated and keeping your productivity high. Now, management over time. You should be reprioritizing at least daily what you're doing. And I gave you the tip there, which is you start your day, you look at what you've got, prioritize it out, and then you start ticking through it. And at the end of the day, you evaluate where you left off and you try to tee up the next day so you can redo that again. Now, you should be looking at your tasks collectively across the week at some point to tee up what is today, what is tomorrow, and what's through the week. Because that's also when you're going to look to see whether or not you can make these tasks more granular, make them more actionable, so you get good fluidity through the week. Again, to further on that one, is you need to break them down. Keep looking at your tasks, because when you created them originally, you may not have had all the information, so you want to refactor them as necessary. And things change. Beginning of the week to the end of the week, a lot of stuff has changed in regards to your client, in regards to what you're doing. And so if a task isn't relevant, if a task isn't needed, either move it out, delete it, but be judicious about keeping that list accurate, up to date, and stuff that needs to be done. Not the hopes, but just the commitments. All right? So let's go take it up a little level. Let's look at project management overall. And from that, again, it's really about quality. Again, this goes back to processes and keeping processes consistent and quality, where the task stuff is really making sure stuff's done on time by looking at them at a very granular level. So again, we talked about this before. A checklist is really a sequence of different to-dos constructed together, basically used as a reminder or as some guideposts to ensure we're getting it done correctly. And again, just because it's easier for me, I pulled up a little bit of what Carbon does to give some visualization of this, but you can see here that we've got a checklist. Again, we've got some things to do. Again, definitely way too broad in general. But again, we've got one checked off. We've got a series that's going to happen together. We've got due dates and when they're due. We've got the owners of who they are. And again, if we were to drill down in this further, then we've got the construction of the information that we need for each one of those underlying tasks and how they come together into a flow. And so what I want to point out here, and something that we're going to harp into a little bit later, is every checklist item. The checklist as a whole, and each item that you have underneath that, has to have an owner and needs to have only one owner. I know there's a lot of folks out there that say, well, two people need to be across this. Well, if two people need to be across this, then split it up. If one person's owning part of it and one person's owning the other part. If that's not the case, then one person needs to own it, and you can keep somebody else consulted with or informed on what's going on here. But there needs to be only one throat to choke on making sure that something gets done. And if they need to go and get assistance, then it's their job to go get that in order to support the completion of it. If you don't do that, you're going to find that your progression and processes is going to stall, and everyone's going to point the finger at everybody else because nobody knows who's picked up the ball or who's dropped it and where it needs to go next. There's just too much ambiguity in there. So again, that's the first one here where that assigned to bit is. So it needs to be assigned to somebody. We've already talked about the fact that there's really two different due dates. There's the due date of this checklist, and then there's the due date of the task, which sits in our list of things to do. And then the next one really comes on to the description of this. Again, when you're talking about this, again, your statement of, let's say, this add new hires into payroll, that is the task, that's the thing that needs to be done. But it lives as part of a process, and that process needs to be sitting on that living repository. And the description of what this is needs to be the underlying how-to steps of what to go do with this. If I've got a new hire in my firm that's going to follow this checklist to do something, this is something that they can read to figure out where to go and how to do it. And so again, this is where we've got a hyperlink to what our payroll system is here that we threw in here. But we've also hyperlinked it out to the detailed steps of the process, that full process in view and the underlying details of the what and the how and the why. The reason for doing this is when you're creating checklists across your firm and you've got many, many different people that may work, or even just a small number, to go into every single checklist after created and to update it one by one is something you'll never do. And so you want your detailed processes living in one place, and you want to reference that amongst your checklists so that when you're doing constant process improvement, those processes, if I ever click into them, I will get the latest and greatest and know about it. So I'm doing the change management when I do processes, but this is the way to ensure that when someone forgets that, they know they can just click and get to the most up-to-date information, and you don't have to worry about the massive updating problem you're going to have. Now, I wrote on the bottom of here, precise, efficient, and easy to use, and that's the keys with a checklist. Again, the tasks that construct them need to be precise, and the details that need to be there need to be available and be able to go to them. It needs to be efficient. You need to be able to check through these quite quickly. You need to be able to glance to see what needs to be done in what order and in what time frame. So again, the visualization and the construction is good in order to give context, and it needs to be easy to use. It needs to be quick to edit, quick to adjust, quick to click off, because the whole idea is you don't want to be spending a lot of time having to manipulate these things when you really should just be getting the work done. So that's kind of some of the three different mantras that I want to dive into on that. So again, just like we talked about to-dos, let's talk about a little bit of the construction, the strategies, and some of the considerations when talking about checklists overall. And one of the things I want to do here is I want to actually, because we're going to talk about this on the construction down below, I just want to throw out a polling question here, which is, on average, when you look at your checklist, how many items do you usually sit in that checklist? Is it a small number, like 3 or less? Is it around 5? Is it 7 or less? Is it 8 or more? Or do you not even use checklists at all? So let's go, let's give it a few moments here so people can vote in. Right now, it looks like those people who have checklists have a large number of steps, 8 or more. Let's go ahead and close it out. So the overarching majority is 8 or more, and then there's a sprinkling of folks at the lower numbers there. So I'll give you some context. So let's go through this. So background. Checklist, again, is a sequence of tasks in order to complete a process. There's really two different types. There's what's called a do and confirm, and then there's the read and do. And one's, you're just following a routine. The other one's really a recipe. For all of us out here, it's, the do and confirm, that's really just a reminder technique because it's something that we do day in and day out, and it's just kind of a reminder of what it is. But the most often one that you'll see and what almost everyone here is doing, the read do, which is, okay, I'm jumping into a project. What do I need to do next? I'm going to read what that step was. I'm going to remember how to do it. I'm going to jump off to do that. I'm going to come back, check it off, and go to the next one. So you can think of it about if I'm making a cake, I got to add this ingredient, add that ingredient, mix it together, put it in the oven, bake it, serve it, eat it, be joyful. Again, we already covered the precise, efficient, and easy to use, so let's look at the construction. Now, I know a lot of you have basically said you've got these long lists of what to do. Now, the question goes into maybe the checklist needs to be broken down into multiple different checklists in order to complete. The recommended amount is really 5 to 9 items per list. I can tell you from the number of checklists that we see across all the practices that we have, the overarching majority is just like what folks voted here, which is there's 9 or more. The problem that comes with a checklist that's super long is the inability to be able to complete the checklist, and the fact that it looks, when you're looking at it at a glance, if someone's going to look at, if there's 100 steps and you've gotten through 8 of it, then your progress meter is showing like 8%. And you don't necessarily, when looking at it from an owner or a manager's perspective, understand how far someone's really gone, because those step progressions are so small because there's just such a large count. Now, if you break those checklists up into more granular bits, and again, there's sub-processes to the overarching processes, then you get the satisfaction of being able to check a lot of things off, a sense of completion from the person who's doing it, but then better visibility across the progression of the project itself. And so that's why the experts out there will tell you that 5 to 9. If you go really, in my opinion, down below 6 or so, then really it's just a bunch of to-dos, and really is it constructed as a process. And maybe you probably haven't made your stuff granular enough. So, I view the sweet spot really be 7 to 9. Again, remember that what these are really underlying to-dos and tasks, and so they're going to have that standard construction of the verb, noun, and object. They need to be one line because they need to be actionable and understood quickly. And again, the reason for that is a checklist item should have a description and all the details. So you don't need to do more than one line, because you need to have a description of what's there, and you need to be calling out to your detailed processes, like I mentioned before. And you really just need to list what's important. There may be some other stuff in there that's implied or understood. You don't necessarily need to go ahead and put all that in there. It doesn't need to be, something that a brain dead individual, needs to follow, because again, you're probably not hiring brain dead individuals into your firm. The strategy, again, we talked about, I can't impress this enough on folks. It's one owner per item per checklist. So ensure that that's the case. Your checklist items are essentially your to-dos. You got to link to your process. And these, again, the checklists needs to be, and we're going to say it here in a second, need to be flexible. And you constantly need to be improving them and updating them. And then from those updates, being able to leverage them across what you do over your firm. Other considerations are, we talked about it, there's the difference between due dates of the checklist items and to-dos, which are when I'm actually going to get that thing done, not necessarily when the process has to complete. You've got to allow for these things to be flexible. There's a lot of different solutions out there that I've seen over time that are very rigid. And what happens is every client operates just slightly differently. And so if you've got 10 tasks that need to be done in the process, or 10 steps in the process, guaranteed that one of those is going to need an adjustment, because the customer operates maybe slightly different. They want something delivered differently. They wanted to have an extra check-in step, or we need to do a little bit more due diligence, whatever it might be. But if that checklist is locked and not allowed to be customized by the people who are doing the work, it's not going to be adhered to, or critical steps are going to be forgotten as it's passed over from person to person, or as I'm super busy, I'm not thinking about it. And so ensure that you can take each checklist and you can adjust it singularly and not impact your standard process that you're using across all the different clients that you have. So don't be too rigid. Make sure each one can be unique. And then keep an archive of what your original checklist was. The reason for this is, again, you're going to be adjusting to each and individual client, but when a new client comes up, you want to be able to, here's the baseline that we had, it's the 80%, go ahead and make your adjustments for your last 20%, whoever's going to own this particular checklist. And again, think about it. Keep them as simple as possible. The more complex you make it, the more difficult it is to use, the less likelihood anyone's going to follow it, use it, and again, adherence here is key in order to improve your productivity, which ultimately lowers your costs and increase your profitability of your firm overall. All right. So that's my deep dive there into the checklists themselves. Now I want to roll it all up and give you what I think are the 5 key points across each one of those horizons that we've talked about. So kind of bring this to a nice little, button it up, put it into a nice little bow. So the first one, again, we're going to start from the tasks, okay? And so my number one here is Keep your tasks detailed and as granular as possible. We talked about this. If you don't do this, you're going to lose valuable time trying to remember the context, trying to remember what to do. So just make your life easier and spend that time up front to do that work. The second thing here is when you're done with the task, create the next. We haven't talked about this yet. But remember that generally things aren't singular in time. I mean, if I talked about my own personal tasks and to-dos, that might be more the case. When we're talking to ones that are business related, they're generally relationships. And again, we're a relationship business. And so when I complete one thing, it generally leads me to do something else. So for example, even if it wasn't, let's say it was a tax return for somebody that we had to complete, and I finished the tax return, and my last task was send confirmation to the individual tax client that the IRS has provided a confirmation that the tax return was received. Okay, boom, I checked that off. Well, my next task would be one of a couple of different things. Send a thank you card to this individual client, thanking them for their business this year. And that might be my next one. It could be ensure tax client is in my list of contacts to notify in the fall to tee them up for tax work in the next calendar year. Again, even though the completion of what this process or thing was doesn't mean that the task and its chain of events has completed. It's probably going to be ongoing. And by doing this, what you're going to be able to find is that the relationships with your clients and your attentiveness to detail and making sure things don't fall through the cracks, you're going to be much better at that because you're always teeing up the things that need to happen in order to make the business run smoothly. So again, this is one of the ones that we've learned internally, and it's made a sea change difference in what we do and how we do it. Auto remind yourself. There's some tools out there, and people do this with emails because they unfortunately use their inbox as their to-do list, which is not, again, I do not recommend that at all, but they use a product like Boomerang. If you use Slack, they've added this auto remind functionality to it as well. But what happens here is, you look at something, you read it, you process it, you go, shoot, I need to do that, but I can't do it right now because so-and-so is calling me on the phone. And so they use a service like Boomerang or there's like an auto reminder feature within Slack or other programs out there, and you say, remind me in an hour or 3 hours or whatever it is. And so while the task has come to a stop, you're able to remind yourself to pick it back up. And that's, again, even when you're talking about things that are out even further, that's even more critical. But it's a really key thing to keep progression going and making sure that when you look at the list, you remind yourself of the importance and when it needed to be done. Again, we talked about this before. The reprioritization is so key. And again, it's really an in the evening prepping the next day, and in the morning, what am I going to do today? So at the bare minimum, you should be doing that. You should be writing down. I know some people think it's painful, but even if you're by yourself, you're a sole proprietor, write down what you're going to do for the day and make it actionable. It will keep you honest with yourself. It'll help you understand the type of scope that you can take each and every day. And it will help you be more efficient and help you be more thoughtful on what needs to be done and when it needs to be done. And the last one really goes into that time horizon we've talked about before. What do I need to do today? What needs to be done tomorrow? What's this week? What's next week and beyond? And just bucketing what those tasks overall are into each one of those discrete buckets so you can process them quickly when you get to processing each day and each week. So that is tasks overall. Let's go to projects. So what are the top 5 things here on projects? Most critical thing is, and this goes across everything, one owner for everything. There should be one owner of the client, one owner of the project, one owner of the checklist, one owner of each checklist item, one owner of a task or a to-do. And the reason for that is it creates ownership, it creates accountability, and it makes people understand the responsibility they have to make sure it's done. Because most likely, each one of those things is going to have an impact on something else. And so while the ownership may change from task to task, process checklist to the checklist to the owner, again, the owner of the project may not be the owner of some of the underlying items. But that's what's going to help you with the handoffs back and forth and make sure that things are done when they need to be done. because anytime two people are involved, the fingers gets pointed one way or the other. Checklist, again, we talked about flexibility. It's really an 80-20. It's the Pareto effect. Whatever you build is going to be pretty good, and the majority is going to be correct, but every client's a little bit different, and so you need to make sure you bake that in. Keep your detailed processes and knowledge base. We talked about this earlier in the standardized process section. You need to write out what your as-is processes are, what you want your ideal or to-be processes to be. You want to have that fully available for everybody. It's a living, breathing document. It changes over time. And because of the fact it is a living document, it needs to be sitting in an online repository by which you're calling out to that from the work that needs to be done, so that you can update something once and then propagate it across all different things you do and how you do it. So again, think about that with keeping your detailed processes. Fourth one here is think of it as a relay race. And this goes back to because of the fact that there's one owner for everything. Information and tasks are handed between one person and another. And so because of the fact you're handing things off back and forth, you need to be sure that you're doing the confirmations that something's done and somebody knows that they're being flagged to do something next. Don't assume that they're just going to magically know that it's there. Again, technology can help you out with this by giving you notifications when something's complete and something's on your plate to own. But if the technology wasn't the case, and again, you're just following things on your own independent realms, when you're done with what you are and what you have in the process, and you know it's different for the next step is for somebody else, call them out, tell them that you're done, get confirmation from them that they know that you're done and they're going to pick it up, because just because you've sent something to someone doesn't mean that they've actually taken it up. And so again, if you do that little bit of extra work, you're going to find that things don't slip through the cracks, and you ultimately are making sure that things are progressing as needed. And the last one here is there's not one date that rules them all. There are multiple due dates for things, because what I'm going to prioritize to do in my day-to-day is different than when the actual process is dictated that something has to be done in order to make the due date that was promised to the client. And so you are tracking different dates for that reason. And so be cognizant of that. That is indeed the case. Okay, let's go for the last 5 here as we wrap things up on today's talk. So on the work, and this goes back to how this all comes together, you really want to keep a steady set of operation mechanisms. So again, when looking at today, this goes back to what are my tasks that I'm going to agree that I'm going to do today? Write them down. In companies with a lot of different people, they call this a stand-up. You can use an online product to communicate to everybody across the organization. Here's what I'm doing. This is what I'm agreeing to do today, and everybody does the same. And that gives you visibility and transparency across all the different things and tasks that are going on with the firm overall. And a week, that's really a summarization of what's been done. And the reason for doing this goes back to the visibility discussion that we've had. For what's being done today and this week, you want to be able to, just like you're going to tee up the next day and what you're going to do, you want to tee up the next week, because at the end of your Friday, you're going to have a couple of days off, hopefully, and then on Monday, you're going to pick up where you left off. But if you haven't done the prep work for Monday, you got to do all this remembering that had happened for this week in order to get there. Month is really just a recap of where projects and clients are sitting. That's generally done at a higher level of the firm. And then quarterly is really from a partner level, communicating out the progress of the firm to the overarching goals that we collectively have. Number 2, and this goes back to if you really want to be ultimately ensuring that the group is productive and following the work and being on top of it, you've got to have a mindset that everyone's tracking everything. Because if you're not, you're going to find checklists half done, tasks that are not marked off, and you have no idea where anything sits. And what happens is, even if you're an individual, you start to get lost in your own maze that you've created. And so it's not a one-time spring cleaning. It's consistently tracking, writing things down, ticking things off, and moving on. You need to find and eliminate bottlenecks. This really goes to the standardized processes discussion. And again, if you want to continue to have good fluidity of your work through your processes, finding out where the bottlenecks are in terms of your resources or the processes, that's really key to be able to uncover lots of areas of goodness to be able to get more through your productivity or your pipeline, your work pipeline overall. again, if you want to learn more about that one, check out the standardized processes discussion. Culture of sharing and asking for help. Here's the issue. When you're dealing with tasks and project management, you need people to raise their hands when they're in trouble. And again, if you don't have a proper culture for that, it will continue. That raising of hand happens much later when possibly things aren't recoverable. And so when things start to go a little bit sideways, you want people screaming from the rooftops about that so other people can jump in. And again, that helps to make sure that that project can get back on track, but it doesn't impact other projects in the pipeline. And then lastly, and again, we'll talk again if you want more about this, but you got to have spare capacity. And so don't overload your system. Always have a little bit of spare capacity available because that's going to help you in case, again, things go sideways, but it also helps you with being able to spend the time in order to write down the task and build the checklist, have the right processes, and be able to fine tune those. If you don't have extra capacity, you're constantly chasing and you're constantly finding yourself behind on things. So that really brings us to the end of today's webinar on how-to guide for checklists and tasks. Again, I talked about this before. There was a whole bunch of underlying topics that we went to. We had started with really just the basics at the beginning of the month. Then we talked about standardized processes, capacity planning, not missing deadlines, and today was really on those checklists and tasks. Overall, it's been a pretty big month. Again, all those things are available at carbonhq.com/events. I didn't actually give a demo or an intro of Carbon today. We do that every Tuesday and Thursday. Just for those at you, let's just pop up that last polling question. If you're interested in learning more about Carbon, just let me know. Happy to reach back out, spend the time on that. Again, I'm going to close the poll relatively quickly. So if you'd rather watch paint dry as option number 2 is, let me know. Let me go ahead and close that poll. 3, 2, 1. Like all the different webinars that I give and so forth, not only do I want to say thank you, but I want to take a look here what questions we might have. But if you want to get Carbon, you can go to carbonhq.com to get Carbon. My email's there at ian@carbonhq.com. Happy to talk about any of the content today. Happy to discuss what you may be doing or improvements you want to make. Again, feel free to email me there at ian@carbonhq.com. And again, thank you for your time.